Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's installment of the Spring Seminar Series hosted by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Centre for Hellenic Studies at Simon Fraser University. Each year, we invite scholars to present their research on a wide range of topics in the fields of archaeology, classics, Byzantine, Ottoman, modern Greek history, as well as literary and cultural studies in general. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event was organized at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain, which is located on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. Before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions or concerns about SFU's privacy and security guidelines, I ask you to visit the SFU IT Services website. So, I'm pleased to present Dr. Ivaylo Lozanov, Assistant Professor of Classical Archaeology at the Department of Archaeology at Sofia University in Bulgaria, as well as an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University. His principal research interests lie in ancient urbanism, political history, religion, trade, and economic relations in the Eastern Mediterranean, with a particular focus on ancient Thrace in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. For more than 20 years, Dr. Lozanov has been the director and co-director of numerous archaeological excavations in Bulgaria. He's the co-author of 2 international interdisciplinary projects studying the Thracian elite of the late Iron Age, in collaboration with the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology, Max Planck Society, Germany, and the Department of Archaeology at SFU. He has authored numerous papers, including a chapter on Roman Thrace in a Wiley-Blackwell Companion of Ancient Thrace. With no further ado, now please give a warm digital welcome to Dr. Lozanov, whose talk is titled From Macedonian Outpost to a Hellenistic Polis, the Ancient City of Kabyle in Thrace. To you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dimitri, and thank you to all. It's not an easy task to speak today in front of an audience, having in mind what happened in the world in the recent days. So I'm even more grateful to the Center of the Hellenic Studies at SFU for inviting me to give this talk here. And what I can say is that our thoughts and our conscience are fully committed with those now suffering in Ukraine. And let's hope that the crisis soon will be ended. Now, the present talk, the theme of my lecture, is devoted to archaeological site and an ancient city where I worked for more than 20 years. And I would like to present in front of you the most spectacular results of the archaeological investigation, as well as some thoughts of how the site changed in space and time, with particular focus on the Hellenistic period. Otherwise, the ancient city is actually a multidimensional site. In chronological terms, it spans the periods between the Hellenistic, Roman, late Roman, and medieval periods. This long continuity of habitation actually left tangible traces on the site, and it was only in the late medieval period when the site was completely abandoned, and several villages actually emerged after the civic structure was destroyed. Now, the ancient city is situated at about 7 kilometers northwest of the modern Yambol on a plateau-like terrace at the foothill of a large mountainous elevation. The lonesome hillside sprawling up next to the bend of the river Tunja, ancient Tonsos, is the last offshoot of the eastern Srednagora mountain. The hill backbone, stretching up from west to east, has three rocky culminations, three rocky summits. The Wolf's Rock, the Central Rock, and the Grand Rock, raising above the surrounding plain. Its commanding position and the fertile fluvial area stimulated settlement life there since most distant times. The history of research started in 1885, when the ancient ruins were visited and first described by the pioneer archaeologist in Bulgaria, the Czech brothers Škorpil, who tentatively identified the site with ancient Diospolis. Almost at the same time, another prominent scholar, Irecek, having visited the ruins, understood the evidence in the Roman itineraria, these are the road books, and gave correct identification with Kabyle. So Irecek was the first one who correctly identified the site. Systematic archaeological research began only in 1972 by a team of the National Archaeological Institute and Sofia University, St. Clement Ohridsky. Their efforts made the site central in studying Thracian and classical archaeology in Bulgaria. With the dawn of the new era, Kabyle started to foster generations of young students in history from Sofia University, St. Clement Ohridsky, working on summer archaeological campaigns. Tradition was established during the last 20 years, and today the excavations of the site and students' training are managed by the Department of Archaeology at Sofia University. Kabyle is also a national archaeological reserve. Since the early 80s, an archaeological base equipped with laboratory for field conservation and restoration of artifacts is fully operational. On-site archaeological museum welcomes its visitors with rich collection of the most impressive local finds. Extensive studies in Kabyle are favored by the fact that no modern settlement has been developed over the ancient site. The entire microregion is accessible, affording, besides digging, all sorts of field observations. Necropolises and satellite sites are well recorded around, contributing towards more complete understanding of the urban life. Total conditions are extremely favorable for long-standing systematic research. The site is perfectly integrated within the modern infrastructure. The new highway runs some half kilometer south, and it provides a road connection with the most important routes throughout the country. Long before the emergence of Kabyle, the region was studied with prehistoric sites of the so-called tell type. Roughly 10 were recorded around Yambol within the fertile fluvial plain, stretching their existence through several millennia during Neolithic, Chalcolithic, and Bronze Age. One such tell, Yasatepe, is situated about 1 kilometer southeast of Kabyle. The earliest population of Thracian origin also left tangible traces in Yambol region. To the south, in Sakar Mountain, the early Iron Age witnessed the emergence of the first monumental tombs in Thrace, the so-called dolmens. To the early Iron Age date also the first traces of human activity on the territory of the future city of Kabyle. Most of the finds belong to the characteristic handmade Thracian pottery, gray or black burnished, decorated with incised or stamped geometric pattern. These are coming from the area, from the northern area of the site, on a natural low plateau overlooking the closer surroundings of the river bend. Insufficient as it may seem, ceramic finds are indicative of the existence of an early Thracian settlement. Whether it continued down to the foundation of the ancient city is still unknown. Actually, the history of the ancient site comes through insufficient and fragmentary literary evidence, supplemented to a certain extent by inscriptions, coins, and archaeological excavations. Nevertheless, there are enough blank pages and controversies. In two orations, the famous Athenian Demosthenes makes brief digressions on the war between Macedonian King Philip II and the Odrysian Chersobleptes in Thrace in 342-341 BC, where several important strongholds reportedly have been taken by Macedonians. One of these mentioned was Kabyle, assaulted by Philip. The phrase in the original Greek text implying significant and probably fortified site. However, until now, the archaeological research over the entire urban area is unable to record secure traces of an alleged pre-Philip period. A vague expression in Demosthenes infers that after seizing Kabyle and other Thracian strongholds, Philip went straight to major rebuilding. A brief passage in Diodorus Siculus concerning the same events says Philip invaded Thrace and overcame the Thracians in several battles, imposed on the conquered barbarians the payment of a tithe to the Macedonians, and founded strong cities at key places. The most important of these foundations seems to have been Philippopolis, established by Philip and named after him, here in the central Thracian plain, and Kabyle on the Tonsus River, securing the access to the Black Sea littoral. Kabyle was all the more named a Macedonian colony. It is generally believed the evidence on Philip's foundations in Thrace implies mainly planting of military garrisons, drawing an obvious parallel to the Athenian so-called klerouches, settlements of armed Athenian colonists. However, series of ancient texts record population, often with negative characteristics, forcefully driven to another place. Thus, fragments of Theopompus and Plutarchus and Strabo identify a city called Poneropolis, the city of villains, which many believe that could be either Philippopolis or Kabyle in Thrace. The objection that forceful settlement of unreliable people on a recently conquered territory would prove too dangerous seems reasonable. Perhaps on that case, Plutarchus' narrative about Alexandroupolis, colonized by mixed population, is quite telling. The following formula could be inferred. Contemporaneous settling of Greeks and Macedonians, military colonists possibly detached directly from the ranks, as well recent enemies and other unreliable elements having been forcefully driven. It is difficult to answer on what terms, if any, local Thracians have been admitted to citizenship in the newly created urban communities. The new foundations appear to have been set up on territory taken by the natives and handed down to the new settlers, though their civic status is not readily apparent through the written sources. Here I should mention a very indicative example with Amphipolis, situated here at the mouth of river Strymon, where Philip, actually taking it from the local Thracians, established his own protege, local Thracian nobleman, Sparges, who became his overseer and eponymous official in the city. Perhaps the same formula actually was applied when Philip established his garrisons at Philippopolis and Kabyle in inland Thrace. The archaeological evidence for that period actually is very meager, mainly because the later structures, as we can see them now, from the late Roman and early Byzantine period, actually destroyed most of the earlier architecture. Still, we have an evidence for at least three main stages in the existence of the city in the Hellenistic period. The first stage comprises the time from the third quarter of the 4th century until the second quarter of the 3rd century BC. It was characterized initially by the construction of the fortifications and the creation of an urban layout following contemporary Hellenistic models, with a city square, possibly here in the central part, orthogonal street grid, public and residential buildings. The fortified area of the Hellenistic city exceeds 21 hectares, enclosing the topmost heights of the rock sanctuary here at Zajcevrch. The massive protective wall, supplied with bastions and towers, takes an abrupt fall down the hill slopes to embrace almost the whole plain next to a small tributary to River Tonsus. The wall construction is composed of local dressed stones, forming regular rows, excuse me. Forming regular horizontal rows in some spots, tending to assume polygonal shape. Actually, this technique is chronologically indicative for the same period, and it can have a dating value by itself. Almost the whole track of the western curtain wall with bastions, towers, and the gate is studied. The main street takes its way into the city from the western gate, passing through the central area here, where the Agora complex, it means the civic square, is to be expected, and reaching the opposite eastern gate. There are partly excavated structures around the street that are to be identified with some domestic and public buildings. A closer study of these buildings is hampered by the above later constructions. Besides the fortification wall, actually in the recent years, we have results, very promising results in that central part, where a large building with maybe a kind of square open air area here were excavated. Here were actually the pavement of the square next to the building have very rich material with chronological value. These are amphora stamps, amphora fragments, coins, imported fragments of imported ware, etc. that we'll discuss later on. But still, on that small area, which is no more than 100 square meters, we have so much observations for that sequence of chronological periods covering the whole Hellenistic age. The same could be inferred from the results here, where we have a kind of architectural stratigraphy, Roman and late Roman buildings on top of Hellenistic structures. And here we were lucky enough to discover a domestic hearth called Eschara, dated with coins in the mid-3rd century BC. Unfortunately, we were unable to extend our research because of those large later buildings surrounding the area. So we have very limited observations here, but in terms of stratigraphy, they are very promising. Another of that kind of domestic hearths which were used with ritual purposes was found next to the north wall, and maybe here it served the garrison in that part of the city. So we know that after Philip and Alexander went to the Persian campaign, there were many administrative officials that were imposed to rule Thrace in the name of Philip and Alexander, later Alexander. And one of them, Lysimachus, actually was gained strength and power to extend his dominion in inland Thrace, facing many of the scattered Thracian smaller kingdoms and trying to impose his way on them. We know that Lysimachus actually in the last quarter of the 4th century built his capital, Lysimachia, here on the Gallipoli Peninsula, on the neck of the Gallipoli Peninsula, and from here tried to extend his way in inland Thrace. And we know that following the politics of Philip II and Alexander to make the Thracian elite cooperative, actually he chose some Thracian noblemen to represent him in the inner cities, while Lysimachus tried to conquer more land north in the area next to the river Danube. So one of those overseers in the name of the Macedonian ruling Thrace was certain Spartacus, whom we know from ancient literary sources, as well as by a large inscription found in the so-called Seuthopolis. This was the residence of the king Seuthes III, who was first enemy and then an ally of Lysimachus. So Spartacus and Seuthes, both of the same stock, of Thracian stock, actually were engaged in a period of peaceful and wartime relations. And thanks to that inscription found in Seuthopolis, which was to be copied in Kabyle as well, we know certain details about their relations. Very important for Kabyle and for the civic structures built there were those lines of the inscription where we have evidence that Kabyle has a sanctuary of the goddess Phosphorus. Perhaps this was an epithet of Artemis. And on the agora, on the civic square, we have also an altar of Apollo. So we have pretty much two of the Hellenic basic deities, Apollo and Artemis, are worshipped in Kabyle. We know also that Hellenic cults were worshipped in Seuthopolis as well. The Great Seuthopolis inscription attests, in contrast to the evidently stable situation of Spartacus in Kabyle, a relative deterioration of the position of Seuthopolis, where the wife of Seuthes III, a Macedonian princess called Berenike, seems to have taken the rule after the presumed demise of her husband. She is mentioned together with her 4 sons, who were probably still underage. If we trust the usual dating of the Great Seuthopolis inscription, which is around the 80s of the 3rd century BC, the activity of the local Thracian sovereign Spartacus started before the death of Lysimachus. His bronze coins with the legends Basileus Spartoko are, however, believed to have been minted in the city only after the death of his patron. Soon afterward, Kabyle began to autonomously mint coins, a unique development for the whole interior of Thrace in this age. The city continued to mint for a century, including among numerous issues in bronze, silver Alexander-type tetradrachms in the later 3rd century. These large silver denominations called tetradrachm actually were primarily meant to pay mercenaries. So we have a situation where Kabyle either was forced to ransom its position from the local dynasts, or to struck alliances with them. The active and stable coinage warrants the suggestion of political independence of Kabyle in this period as a self-governing Hellenistic polis, while the distribution area of its autonomous and countermarked bronze coins clearly delimits the large city territory reaching to the Balkan Range in the north and to the sea to the southeast. In addition to the usual city coins, the mint of Kabyle also struck occasional royal issues. Besides the issue of Spartacus, we have also a smaller issue of the rulers Kostokos, probably from Celtic or Thracian origin. Here we have a major period dominated by the invasion of the Celts in southeastern Europe and the establishment of a Celtic kingdom at Tilis, which is still unlocated. But for some 60 years, this major political power actually has an important influence in the political life in Thrace. Probably the Celtic kingdom was established here in southeastern Thrace, and Kabyle lay actually in the vicinities of the Celtic kingdom. Despite the uncertainty over the location of Tilis, it seems evident that the Celtic kings could not have ruled over an extensive territory on both sides of the Haemus mountain, from Byzantium to Danube, so the extent of their rule was limited. The ample evidence for the existence of other political entities in the Thracian interior creates rather general picture of political division and fragmentation. There was an unstable coexistence in the 3rd century BC of multiple distinct political units in a disunited southern Thrace. The Celtic kingdom of Tilis was just one element in a complex and presumably constantly changing political mosaic. We also have, for the same period, some scattered epigraphic evidence, fragmentary epigraphic evidence for the relations of Kabyle with some unknown Hellenistic kings. Unfortunately, neither of these inscriptions preserved the name of the king with whom, or the kings with whom Kabyle struck alliances, but that it was an official alliance, we can infer from the text of at least one fragmentary inscription, where, fortunately, we have also an ample evidence for the civic officials called archontes, following the Hellenistic fashion as well. And we have evidence for the city council called boule, and the city assembly called demos. So we have basically evidence for those civic structures characterizing the city as a Hellenistic Polis type community. And it is very important. So after that vague period of monarchic rule in Kabyle following the death of Lysimachus, now we have evidence for the autonomous status of Kabyle as a Hellenistic Polis type community. And it is confirmed actually by the civic coinage, mainly the bronze coinage, where we can read easily the city ethnics, Kabylenon, on the reverse of the coins. Those coins actually bear the emblems, the two emblems of the city, modeled after the main religious cults in the city. On the obverses, we have a head of Apollo, and on the reverses, we have the figure of Artemis called Phosphoros, because her main iconography represents her holding two torches. Also, the civic emblem, the goddess with the two torches, is could be found on the reverses of the larger silver coins, acting as a civic emblem here on the coins of the autonomous tetradrachms and on the coins in the name of Cavaras, the Celtic king. This unique development, silver and bronze coinage, is actually supplemented also by some other evidence for the economic growth and commercial potential of the city. We know this mainly from the large import of amphora. The amphora were meant mainly to transport luxury goods, luxury food actually, and drinks like olive oil and wine. And we have evidence for major exporting centers from all over the Eastern Mediterranean, importing their goods in Kabyle. This is all even more important when we bear in mind that Kabyle is not a maritime city, but it has important connections, river connections with the Propontic area, with the Aegean, and an important land route connection with the Black Sea. So all these imports actually came from different angles. Thanks to the practice of stamping the amphora, the trade amphora, mostly with the name of the local magistrates from the cities exporting that commodity, we are able to date precisely the flow of the imports. So the amphoras are not only important for dating purposes, but they are also important to understand the rhythm of the trading contacts. We have a monographic study of the amphora imports in Thrace in Bulgarian, made by Professor Ludmil Getov from Sofia University. So here we can easily plot on the map the trade relations of Kabyle in that period. As you can see, the main commercial traffic is focused in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Aegean, especially with the cities producing wine and olive oil on the west coast of Asia Minor and on the North Aegean region. So if we bear in mind that for a certain period, all that area actually was under a single rule, the rule of Lysimachus, for whom I've already spoken, then we can understand the stable rhythm of the contacts of the city with those producing centers. We are also allowed to draw some conclusions on the imports from other centers, producing centers, manufacturing tableware, fine tableware, as is the black glossed Attic tableware, and a very important large group abundantly represented on the site, the group of the so-called Pontic area, imitating the shape and the pattern of the black gloss Athenian pottery. So we have two competing producing areas which are abundantly attested in Kabyle. Along many other conclusions, we can also infer that the Hellenistic fashion of drinking and eating actually had strong roots in the city. Also, we have evidence for local ceramic production imitating the shapes of the imported one, but instead of black gloss slip or cover, we have red slip. It's cheaper and easily attainable, more easily attainable than the black gloss burnishing. We have also evidence of local handmade pottery as well, which is the traditional Thracian pottery at that time. But mostly, And most importantly, we have some evidence for local crafts, manufacturing terracotta figurines, very with high quality, which means that the local market was also has also a taste for such quality goods. In the recent years, we have an important result for local wine production. As we saw already, those large producing centers scattered all over the Eastern Mediterranean, we can now claim almost with certainty that Kabyle, at some period from the mid-3rd century BC, for example, produced its own goods packaged in trade containers, in amphorae. Here I was lucky to find a very vague stamp on a handle of such an amphora, resembling the emblem, the civic emblem, the goddess with 2 torches. And I believe that here we have an indisputable evidence for local manufacturing of wine and exporting the wine for maybe for other Thracian consumers further inland. Also, we have something that is an alternative evidence for a regulated trade on the local market. It came through the increasing number of fragmented stamp jars with the civic name Kabylenom, as you can see here, or with the names of eponymous magistrates. We'll see them on the next slide. A couple of names correspond to certain magistrates' monograms and initials attested in the later autonomous Alexander-type tetradrachms issued, so one can reflect further on the chronological concordances of the stamped ceramic jars and the local silver coins of the last 2 decades of the 3rd century BC. It is another important observation, that's concordance between the names on ceramic jars and on silver coins. It can only point that we have here the names of civic magistrates. They could be either the eponymous officials, the archontes, and it is almost certain where we have that case with the preposition epi, where the name actually has that preposition epi, epi Demetrio, epi Eokrato, etc. And for other names, where the preposition epi is lacking, we can conclude that here we have in question a lower status civic magistrates, probably the market controllers, agoranomoi. In either case, actually, we have that sufficient evidence for a regulated trade and established firm measurements for and reliable measurements for liquids and dry measures. Also, we have a fragmented evidence for the existence of special measuring tables called secomata, and comparing them with the more abundant evidence elsewhere from the Hellenic world, for example, in Delos, the main trade port during that time in the Eastern Mediterranean, we can be sure that here we have either evidence for public exchange of commodities or in a private sphere. Having standard forms and capacities, the stamped containers testified that the civic authorities were engaged in fixing official units for dry and liquid goods and in controlling even minor operations and exchange. Probably they were also to guarantee the quality of some product intended for export. And here I can show again that evidence for amphora packaging and amphora stamping with the emblem of Kabyle. As a piece of internal evidence, the rhythm of commercial contacts can only be compared to the synchronous peak in the silver autonomous coinage of Kabyle, along with the tetradrachms with the name of the Celtic king Cavaros. During the initial years of the reign of the Egyptian monarch Ptolemy IV, the Celtic kingdom in Thrace came to an end, amidst circumstances of which we are ignorant. Under the last king, Cavaros, it had retained some political might and importance. Polybius, the historian, briefly mentions that the kingdom of the Celts and their whole tribe were eradicated by the Thracians. The activation of the Thracians and the passive line of Alexandria in Egypt seem to have forced the coastal Greek cities to look elsewhere for allies capable of improving their security. Around the end of the century, actually, we know for two major campaigns of the new Macedonian monarch, Philip V, aiming to re-establish the Macedonian suzerainty over that larger part of Propontis and inland Thrace. And for his attempts, we have abundant literary evidence. What was the role in Kabyle in those processes? We can judge only by fragmentary and inconclusive evidence. However, from the archaeological evidence, we know that more intensive use and redevelopment of certain zones and buildings contributed to a growing density of the inhabited area of the city during that time. Although the general picture is hardly misleading, there are more avenues to be explored towards defining Kabyle's position on the political map of southeastern Thrace in the second half of the 3rd century and the first decades of the 2nd century BC. A favorable opportunity to explore cities' economic relations opens up by studying stamped amphora coming from a major exporting center, the island of Rhodes. Actually, the sequence of Rhodian imports in Kabyle is at best evidence for that period, and we are allowed to trace even the yearly income of Rhodian products at the site, which is a rare picture for an inland site, but very characteristic one for centers around the Eastern Mediterranean. So drawing parallels, we can not only trace the trading contacts and the commercial network and how it had functioned, but also we can make more secure observations of chronology of the site, because the Rhodian stamps are usually dated by the month of the eponymous official when the jars were produced and intended for export. The number of the Rhodian amphora stamps datable in the second half of the 3rd century BC to the first quarter of the 2nd century BC takes around 2/3 of the overall import of the island in Kabyle. They give an impression of stable and regular contacts with one of the leading trading centers in the Eastern Mediterranean. Plotting the data into narrower chronological clusters, however, can draw more detailed and less straightforward picture of the dynamics of commerce and provoke further historical comments. The trade in the region, it means the Propontis area and the North Aegean as a whole, have suffered mostly in the last years of the 3rd century during that expansionist moves of Philip and his allies from Asia Minor. So we know that Philip tried to foster a new Balkan policy. Unfortunately, neither the chronological nor the geographical order of his activities in Thrace provide the secure point. So it is unlikely to have the city, Kabyle, opposed Philip, since the unstable situation after the fall of the Celtic kingdom in the region demanded local civic communities to strike new alliances to warrant their safe existence. In securing his hold in Thrace, Philip would have no use of ruined civic centers. By capture or voluntary surrender, striking a treaty, or being garrisoned, as was the case with the coastal cities here, smaller communities around Propontis were meant to serve as bases for strategic control. Keeping a garrison in a distant city, however, for example, like Kabyle, which lay on the fringes of his largest territorial extensions in Thrace, would not have always, if at all, been possible for Philip, especially in times of maximal strain during the wars in the Aegean. And here we mainly have to remember Philip's conflicts with the Romans. The first appearance of the Romans in the Eastern Mediterranean actually was in the war with Philip. How the archaeological record of those events could be interpreted. Again, I can make closer observation of the Rhodian amphora imports. Here on that table, we can see the rhythm of the imports during the 80s and the early 60s of the 2nd century. And this evidence is even more impressive compared to the meager data of the later periods. Isolated finds of amphora stamps after that period, after the 60s, actually are very, very rare. A period of intensive commercial contacts in Kabyle was followed by market decline. From the late 70s or early 60s, there is no consistent record for amphora imports at the site. Isolated finds of Rhodian, Coan, and Cnidian stamped amphora of the second half of the 2nd century can only show how the trade went on a modest scale. Synchronous breakdown might be suspected in the local coin production. What might have caused such an unfavorable effect? Earlier on, in the 90s of the 20th century, my colleagues believed that it was Philip who was responsible for that sharp decline, invading the country and devastating the local communities. However, we have to consider that Philip intended to build a larger base in Thrace. So he has no benefit of devastating what he intended to be his economic backbone in an attempt to restore his kingdom suffered from the war with Rome. Internal archaeological evidence provides the necessary background to find alternative historical circumstance explaining the sharp decline of the city's economic potential in the 60s of the 2nd century. Rhodian imports can be practically affected by the difficulties the island experienced in the mid-60s when Delos, in the heart of the Cyclades, was declared a free port by the Romans and gradually absorbed much of the commercial traffic in the Levant. This, however, is a distant perspective. Other factors of regional importance might have had direct impact on the problem. Below here, I'll discuss the invasion of the Bastarnae, one of the barbarian tribes north of Danube, and their marches to Thrace as an alternative catalyst. Bastarnian invasion was part of Philip's political project to outweigh the drawbacks of his relations with Rome in the late 80s of the 2nd century. Whether he actually or not got planned to send the host against Italy, having them first to plunder Thrace, is a matter of debate. In 179 BC, after they crossed Danube, the Bastarnae took their way south until they reached the ancient Dunax mountain here in western Thrace. And on their way actually lie all those rich cities, the Greek colonies on the Black Sea littoral. And then the most natural route in inland Thrace was via Kabyle and Philippopolis through the Thracian plain west. The main route ran through a land lying beyond Philip's direct control, so he had to negotiate their safe passage and provision through his diplomatic net among the Thracian tribes and dynasts. Meanwhile, the news for the death of Philip apparently brought some Thracians to defection from their earlier obligations. The new king, Philip's heir, Perseus, chose not to intervene and without blocking the movement left the Bastarnae on their own. Royal indifference perhaps motivated Thracians towards an open resistance, and here in the conflict, part of the Bastarnians settled in Dardania, and the other part actually retraced their steps back to the Black Sea and then beyond Danube. So we can infer from those literary texts that the hinterland here of those Greek cities, mainly Apollonia and Mesembria, served as a convenient and perhaps more permanent base for provisioning the Bastarnian army, their wives and children. Kabyle lay also within. The cities may have had a compact mediated or not by Philip, leaving them largely intact with the obligation to provide for the Bastarnian army, or they may have been brought to a forceful agreement. But for us, for our purposes, it is the second arrival of the Bastarnae in the spring of 168 BC. It was no longer a matter, as in the days of Philip, of a mass migration. It was only a question of obtaining a fixed number of mercenary reinforcements for the war with Rome and her Dardanian allies. And the Bastarnian king Clondicus made a compact with the Macedonian king Perseus to provide 20,000 men, and in return to receive 1,000 gold pieces for himself and 1,050 gold pieces in total. After protracted negotiations through swapping envoys, Perseus, the Macedonian king, decided to cancel his earlier promises and to send back the Bastarnae from the fringes of Macedonian kingdom through Thrace back to the Danube. His reasons were rather practical. A horde of independent barbarians, difficult to be fed and controlled, would return eventually in an unruly multitude beyond the necessities of military and financial order. On their way back, the Bastarnae, frustrated by having failed to receive the stipulated pay, indulged in extensive plunder. The short and very laconic phrasing in our Roman and Hellenistic sources cannot adequately describe the crippling effect of the blow. The devastation of inland Thrace took place at the end of the Third Macedonian War with Rome, when the country was left practically defenseless. The major ally, the king of the Odrysae, the major ally of the Macedonians, was engaged in the war with Rome south. So unlike the earlier marches in the 70s, no diplomatic compact could deter the violence. No safe passage and no provisions could have been obtained, but forcibly. In this situation, the few urban centers on the line of march, Kabyle and probably Philippopolis, would naturally attract the huge and mobile Bastarnian army for further extortion and preying. In the light of the archaeological evidence, it is at this point when the fortunes of Kabyle must have dramatically changed. The abolition of Macedonian monarchy in the next year, 167, brought further disruption of the political and economic network in the Balkans, continued Roman indifference for a larger commitment in North Aegean, and the slim hold of the Pergamian kingdom, here in Asia Minor, over the Thracian Chersonese, made room for smaller political entities to lay their limited claims in southeastern Thrace. In this situation, a type of community as it was in the 3rd century, Kabyle proved to be obsolete, cut off from the regular context to the south, surrounded by competing claimants, the Odrisse from the west, the Keni from the south, and the Aste from the southeast. For some time, the waning city could breathe thanks to its most important outlet at the Black Sea, Mesembria. In 72 BC, the Roman army of the general Lucullus invaded Thrace through Hebros and Tonsus rivers and reached Kabyle, only to close the final chapter of Kabyle's Hellenistic history. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for this very rich presentation, which in my mind at least clarifies a lot of things about the history of what from the Greek perspective often appears as a bit of a Wild West. The Greek history perspective appears as a Wild West on the margins of the Greek world, but appears to be so integrally connected with it. I would like to note for our attendees that you could submit questions through either the Q&A function or the chat box. I'll try and follow both and relate them to our speaker. And in anticipation of possible questions, I wonder whether I could throw one at you myself. In speaking about the political, economic, social history of these lands, you refer to tribes and dynasts all the way to the period of Philip V in the 3rd and basically 2nd century BCE. And at the same time, the evidence that you present from the epigraphic side of things gives us certain suggestions that the kind of communication, that the kind of social structure might exist in these cities with a vouli, a demos, and archontes. That is, as you pointed out, very similar to the social structures that we see in any kind of Hellenistic city in Asia Minor, for example, communicating with great Hellenistic kings. And what I wonder is, what is that relationship between tribes, dynasts, and the city, and how does this social structure, epigraphically attested, penetrate or not penetrate within the Thracian hinterland? What could we say something on this?
Yeah, of course. Actually, the urbanizing efforts of the Macedonian kings, starting from Philip II, were largely intended to create that social structure in inland Thrace, social and economic structure of a Hellenic type community, because it was the only known tool for exploiting larger territory for economic exploitation and political control. But this is a precarious situation. This is a precarious model in Thrace. As you can see, every time when a major power failed to establish firm control in inland Thrace, local dynasts took hold and tried to exploit these communities for their own purposes and for their own benefits. However, they are not conscious to develop that kind of model of a Hellenistic Polis type community in inland Thrace, with one large exceptions, the town of Sophia, as we saw it, but it was also a kind of advertising of a local ruler, Sosthenes III, who wanted to represent himself as a legal Hellenistic ruler. And once we lose that kind of cohesion between strong ruler and Polis type community in Thrace, that Polis type community is deemed to fail and to wane.
Yeah.
And that's why actually, besides Philippopolis, we do not have a civic structure to survive in Hellenistic Thrace until the Roman conquest.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I wonder if I can do a follow-up before I move to a question from our audience. You speak of this dual currency system of struck bronze coins that coexist with tetradrachms that may have a more kind of military association or a ransoming association that you point out. Do we have evidence in rural areas outside Kabyle, for example, where we find such bronze currency that would indicate that maybe those kinds of transactions at the grassroots level are adopted by a wider population than just the urbanites buying wine?
Yeah, your question actually has a wider implication, how we use bronze and silver coins in antiquity. So it is generally believed that the bronze currency served for everyday purposes, for smaller exchange and buying. But there is still one peculiarity that we have to have in mind, that the bronze currency actually may have served for paying mercenaries on everyday basis. This is the so-called lower mercenary pay, lower grade mercenary pay. And we have as well those larger silver denominations intended to pay mercenaries on monthly or yearly basis. But also, the silver coinage was intended for major commercial transactions, for buying larger imports, for example, wine and olive oil. So obviously, our idea how the ancients use this currency has to be perceived by individual examples. I cannot say that we have this and this kind of currency use unless we have a very direct data for a particular region. So if we relate money with archaeological contexts, that will serve us better. But for now, only in bigger Polis type communities we can do this. In larger rural areas, unfortunately, the coin finds are coming not from archaeological contexts.
So. Well, thank you so much. So I have a question from Edward Williams, who writes, I wonder how many figurines you found and with what sanctuaries they are associated. The fabric looks very much like the type we find in the area of Pergamon or Lesbos.
Oh yeah, I would say that we can extend the list with almost all major producing centers of terracotta figurines in Western Asia Minor. But we have undisputable evidence for local production first. Unfortunately, we do not have secure archaeological contexts in terms of the primarily the original use of these figurines, because they were found in pits, waste pits, that are generally later than the original production of those figurines. So we do not know if they were meant to serve in a domestic area, for example, for local cults, domestic cults, or they were meant for a sanctuary, urban or extra-urban sanctuary. That's why, in anticipation of further archaeological data, I cannot say that they are particularly bound with this and this particular context. Unfortunately, we do not know, but we have many fragments of those figurines.
So, one question that came to me when you mentioned the campaign by Lucullus, if I'm not mistaken, up the river, is how far upriver can one transport goods on boats or rafts
Both
in
rivers,
the Evros and
both major rivers in inland Thrace, the Hebros River and the Tonsos River, were navigable up to their upper course, which means that Hebros was navigable at least to an area west of Philippopolis, modern Plovdiv, and Tonsos, where Kabyle is, was certainly navigable at least Southopolis, which is about 50 kilometers west of Kabyle. The very evidence of those abundant imports transportable by river transport, mainly amphorae and fine ware, actually is our best evidence for that kind of commercial flow in inland Thrace.
Yeah, and there is so this is I read his name. So this is Hector Williams. In our excavations at Stymphalos in Arcadia, we found Hellenistic streets paved with broken ceramics, just as you found at Kabyle. He notes, I have found a few parallels elsewhere. I think it's not so much a question as a comment.
Oh yeah, of course. Actually, it's a very popular reuse of the amphora fragments, especially amphora toes, because they are massive and hard, and they can provide a stable footing and a stable pavement on the ground. But for us, it's a precious material. Most of these pieces are narrowly datable, and in terms of chronology, they are precious.
I have to say that when looking at the maps that you've shared with us, and of course when trying to think of Thracian kings and tribes, and then the attempts of more settled kingdoms to get into these territories, I started having this wider question of how we use maps and cartography and how we throw colors on maps. Something that was also raised recently by a late antique scholar commenting on Ukraine and on all these maps on Russian conquest, and what do they really mean apart from a trunk road and a center and so on and so forth. And it still raises the question, and I guess this is really true of the research we do, of what exactly is the nature of Thracian kingship and tribes? What are their territorial extent? How solid is the color on the map when there is a color? I don't know that I'm asking you to answer this. I'm just thinking with your material about the problems that are raised by this.
Yeah, drawing maps is always an individual enterprise, I would say, but they can produce huge harm, I think. Yeah,
it can distort so massively.
Absolutely.
And since you, especially because you brought Ukraine into the picture, and now with your introduction, the comment that this scholar was making online was that just putting that color on the map to give a sign of the presence of one army or the other creates, leaves an ideological stamp and creates ideological facts that then acquire their own life. And I'm thinking that whether we're talking about antiquity and how we try to understand it through our material evidence, through our textual evidence, or whether we're talking about the modern era, the map becomes such a tricky issue. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. And all the more we have to remember that all these conquests, actually, they are not physically, how to say, they are not physically supplied with more permanent economic base, demographic presence, etc. They were fluctuating in time so rapidly, and actually they do not give the sense of that territoriality that we now have with the modern nation states, for example. But still, when you see them on maps, you inadvertently actually perceive them as a more stable entities than they were actually.
Yeah, it's a problem I face when teaching sort of Byzantine history, and you have this division of the realm of the Roman world into Latin and Greek-speaking worlds, a division that of course elides all these tons of different languages that exist in the hinterlands that are majority compared to, let's say, Greek in the Middle East. But anyhow, I don't see any other interventions or questions from. Okay, Ethan. Let me see if Ethan, I think you can ask your question.
I can do it in the.
Yeah, excellent. Go ahead.
I was just wondering. I might have missed this, but does the site have any kind of sort of late antique or medieval history of occupation?
Yeah. I think I pointed out this earlier. Yeah, actually, the most massive architecture that we have on the site is late Roman and late Roman and early Byzantine architecture. We have two basilicas, two large churches, an episcopal complex, etc., and fortification as well.
Thank you so much.
And as a follow-up to that, given that it had been a location for settlement for so long, do you have any hypothesis for what accounts to its eventual abandonment? What makes it, let's say, irrelevant for the later medieval period and the period after that?
I would say that from the late Roman period, the occupation was not continuous. In the late Roman period, in the 4th century, we know that the settlement flourished. There was actually an attempt during the Constantine and his heirs' time, Constantine the Great, to re-establish the city into his Hellenistic extent, his Hellenistic form, and his Hellenistic splendor. We have street grid, large monumental buildings like those churches, etc. But soon the Goths came, those Germanic tribes invading from north, and that flourishing period ended. And after that, actually, we do not have evidence for reoccupation until the medieval period, maybe somewhere in the 7th, 8th century AD. And the city then was, or the settlement, it was not a city anymore. The settlement then was on the border between the newly established Bulgarian state and the Byzantine Empire.
Okay, so not an ideal spot for a permanent and safe settlement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I want to thank you so much for joining us today for this truly interesting presentation of wonderful material. I understand that there is a lively ongoing field school in on the site that I don't know could potentially be of interest to students at SFU, and there is a site that still has a lot to give, if I get it right.
Absolutely. Only maybe 1/20th or 1/30th of the site is excavated right now. So,
well, thanks again, and I want to thank also our audience for joining us on a day where the shining sun might have been a much greater temptation. I would just like to make one or two general announcements. Our next event will take place next week in person and online, Friday, March 11th, and will feature Dr. Panagiotis Papas from Simon Fraser University's Linguistics Department for a talk on dialect diversity in the Greek of Greek Canadians. If you live in the Lower Mainland, I would encourage you to register for a really interesting event we're hosting on April 3rd at SFU's Goldcorp Center for the Arts, adapted and directed and performed by Yoros Karamichos. Makrigiannis Unplugged is a theatrical performance that tells the story of the prominent Greek independence figure, General Yannis Makrigiannis, through his collected memoirs in celebration of the recent bicentennial anniversary, which we were not able to celebrate in person. You can register for those events on our website or send an email to hscom@sfu.ca. Again, I really want to thank our speaker, Dr. Lozanov, and our audience, and hope to be seeing you in the coming weeks. Thank you so much.
I would like to thank you as well. Warm thanks to everyone. Thank you, Dimitri.